Jehovah from the heavens, praise his name. Praise Jehovah in the highest. All his angels praise proclaim. All his hosts together praise him. Hallelujah and stars on high. Praise his holy survey the wondrous cross, on which the praise of glory high. My gracious King, thy crown of
Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you're awake. It's extremely quiet, so that's kind of I don't know, but it's good to see you tonight. Glad you're here. We'll pick back up in our study this evening of Hurting with God, a study through these Psalms of Lament together. Let me pull this up here. Hope that you've had a good week with the weird Tennessee weather. From storms and rain and cold and hot, and it's crazy. But glad that we had pretty good weather today at least, and beautiful sunshine, so that's a positive. But let me mark that off. We have a handful of lessons left in this series, kind of looking at some of these Psalms and thinking about them in ways maybe we've not thought about them before, and just to kind of try to understand them and allow them to hopefully encourage and bless our lives and strengthen our faith, and so that's kind of what we want to happen with that. But tonight, what we're going to look at is what you would really call the imprecatory psalms, and we'll get to that, what that means in just a second. Randomly closed out on me here, so I wanted you to do. But to start our quotes that we kind of are starting with, one is a song, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and the words, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah." And that was penned by Julia Ward Howe or Howe. And then the other quote is by Denise Domkowski Hopkins, and through the book Journey Through the Psalms. And it says this: "How easy it is for us to condemn ancient Israel's cry for revenge and support our own, hiding behind our more impersonal methods of warfare." These Psalms, and last time we looked at the Psalms of Lament, if you remember, we talked about the enemies and asking for help in some way, and that there were kind of three different ways in which the psalmist would plead for God's intervention and action. And the first, one way they would respond to their enemies is through silence. This was the idea that once a poet, a psalmist has mentioned or described an opponent, that psalmist may not ask God to do anything about it. And rather than asking God to do something about it, the poet may turn his focus inward in self-talk and then really look outward at to other people in encouragement to trust God. Here, at least, what is most important is my reaction, not what happens to my enemy. Trust in God, that God knows how to handle the situation, and wait on God to act at the appropriate time. That's the silence that we looked at with our enemies. The second response is that response of "Please save us." And like the first response, Psalms in this group transfer the focal point from them, the enemy, to me or to us, the victim or victims, which would be the poet and others that would be in need, and ask God to rescue us from them. So while they're part of the conversation, the focus is really on us being delivered from them. Save us, help us, not necessarily do something to them. Now, they're asking God to rescue us from them without telling God how to effect that rescue or what they think God should do to the enemy. Now, to understand, we should, be understanding to realize that these psalmists realize that their deliverance is going to have consequences for their opponents. But they bypass consideration of these effects in favor of a straightforward appeal to God to help us. So if you're asking God, help us or help me, in effect, sometimes that connection is save me from my enemies means you might have to do something to my enemies for me to be saved from my enemies. So the first response with Psalms of lament in regards to enemy being the problem is silence about the enemy and focus more inward and the importance of trusting God and so forth. The second response is, please help us or help me, save me, which is not, again, it's not really focusing as much on the enemy as it is me and my state and my situation, which the enemy brought on, but I'm asking God to help me in this state. The third that we looked at last week, what God will do to them. And this, in kind of this rhetorical effort, if you will, there's a rhetorical effort to warn would-be opponents, to encourage those who are oppressed, and perhaps to make an indirect appeal to God in this kind of way. A number of psalms describe what God will do to their enemies. Among other claims, the poets assert that God will judge them, the enemies, will strike them with terror, will put them to shame. But these texts do not ask God to act against the enemy, at least not directly. Here it's enough to proclaim and celebrate what the righteous know God will do to the wicked. So please help us, save us. Number three, kind of an acknowledgement of what God does to the wicked. Now, there's two kind of final categories here we're going to consider tonight, kind of bridging back to those thoughts from, and that was just a very brief summary from that 2 weeks ago, that class. The two final categories really, and we're looking at imprecatory psalms. Now, along the trajectory between extremes, if you have these extremes, we now arrive at instances in which the psalmist explicitly asks God to do something against the enemy. Now, even with that third one, remember, it's not asking God to do something to the enemy, but it's acknowledging what God has done to the enemy or what God has already said he will do to the wicked and to the enemy. This is shifting, and now you're going to get into an area where the psalmist actually asks God to do something to the enemy, which sounds, should he do that? Should the psalmist do that? And that's kind of what we want to think about tonight. Now, the psalmist explicitly asks God to do something against the enemy. Most literature on the book of Psalms describe these type of psalms as imprecatory psalms. Now, that word imprecatory, does anybody know what it means? Now, to imprecate is really the definition we need to find to understand imprecatory. To imprecate, the definition is to curse, to invoke a curse. And so an imprecatory psalm is, in a way, cursing your enemy, invoking this curse on the enemy, asking God, do something to this person or this people. Because of the large number of these psalms and the variety among these kinds of psalms, we're really going to look at two final groups of these types of psalms. Now, the first one, so remember, in response to enemies, number one, there's the silence. Let's just trust God. Number two, God, please save me or save us from them. Number three, acknowledge and celebrate what God will do to the wicked, knowing that the wicked will have their reward, and that reward obviously being that the punishment they deserve for their wickedness. They'll have what they are due, and so acknowledging that. The fourth, and this is where we get into the imprecatory, is when the psalmist asks God, please judge them. Most imprecatory psalms make brief and simple requests regarding what God should do to the opponents. And there are four ideas that are pretty prevalent throughout several psalms. The first is that God would shame or dishonor the enemy. Now, you probably don't know any off the top of your head in terms of chapter and verse or psalm number and verse, but you might remember in the times you've read through Psalms, there have been moments where you remember the psalmist asking God to shame or dishonor the enemy. It's in several psalms. For example, one puts it this way, let my accusers be put to shame and consumed. Let those who seek to hurt me be covered with scorn and disgrace. In Psalm 71, verse 13. And you see it in Psalm 25, and Psalm 31, Psalm 40, Psalm 70. There's several psalms that have some type of reference to this, the idea that God would shame or dishonor the enemy. The second is that God would judge the enemy. God, judge them. Lord, please judge them. And an example of that is in Psalm 7. It says, "Rise up, O Lord, in your anger. Lift yourself up against the fury of my enemies. Awake, O my God. You have appointed a judgment. Let the assembly of the peoples be gathered around you, and over it take your seat on high." God, it is time for you to bring on that judgment that you've talked about. Bring judgment on my enemies, the wicked ones, the ones that are against not just me. Remember, these Psalms of Lament, we've noticed that a lot of times the psalmist will remind God of who He is and how He's responded in the past, hoping that will encourage God to motivate, remember that process, that cycle, motivate God to do something now that connects back with how He's treated the enemies and the wicked in the past. So here, asking God to bring out that judgment. God, now's the time. Not just this bring shame and dishonor to them. The second thing is to ask God to judge them as they deserve this judgment for their wickedness. The third idea here is the idea that God would repay them what they deserve or what they had planned against the poet, against the psalmist. So what they themselves were wanting to do to the psalmist, you might find some psalms where the psalmist asked God to do that to the enemy instead. One example of this says, "Repay them according to their works and according to the evil of their deeds. Repay them according to the work of their hands. Render them their due reward." That's Psalm 28. Psalm 28:4, we see it also in Psalm 5 and Psalm 56, Psalm 141. So there's that idea. Repay them what they are due. The fourth idea here is that God would cut off or destroy the enemy. Now, this request may be limited to the offending body part of the foe, for example. For one example, in Psalm 12, verses 3 and 4, I believe it is, says, "May the Lord cut off all flattering lips, the tongue that makes great boasts. Those who say with our tongues we will prevail, our lips are our own, who is our master?" So there's that specific body part that's bringing about the issue. Their lips, their tongue, boasting things that are inappropriate, saying things inappropriate, and doing these things to harm the psalmist, and the psalmist asking God to remove those problems. So there's that image. But there's also maybe a more comprehensive and vivid imagery that's given when it says, "Let burning coals fall on them, let them be flung into pits, no more to rise. Do not let the slanderer be established in the land. Let evil speedily hunt down the violent." Now, that's in Psalm 140, verses 10 and 11. Now, let the burning coals fall on them. That sounds pretty intense. Now, we kind of want to look at these psalms. Each of these psalms makes a direct and concise request for God to act against the enemy, whether it is that God would shame or dishonor the enemy, whether it's that God would bring judgment to the enemy, whether it's that God would repay them what they deserve or do to them what they wanted to do to the psalmist, or whether it was that God would cut off or destroy the enemy, whether it's a body part or whether it's this imagery in this last one where the burning coals are falling on the enemies. Each one is making this direct request for God to act against that enemy. Yet while their appeals are pretty brief, usually 1 to 2 verses, and not developed in great detail, these compact requests really pack a powerful punch. As you think, probably 3 or 4 lessons ago in this series, shame and dishonor were important societal values in ancient Israel. And to lose honor, loss of honor, negatively affected a person's relationships, negatively affected a person's business, his family, and his religion. In other words, to lose honor, to be shamed, would affect all of your life. We've got to try to remove ourselves from the individualistic thinking of our culture. And we've got to put ourselves into the collectivist group mentality of their culture. From the early, the beginnings here of when God created the world, all the way up through the early church, this mentality from Genesis to Revelation, what you see all through Old and New Testament both, is family's important, is most important, and I don't want to do anything to shame my family. Honor is everything, and honor in my family is everything, and So we've got to try to insert ourselves into that kind of culture and look through that lens to understand how detrimental shame and dishonor would be to someone. And a person who requests that an enemy be shamed is not just saying, help them to do something where they're embarrassed. That's not what it's saying. For the psalmist to ask God to bring shame or dishonor on someone would be for God to act in a severe and harmful manner. That's what the psalmist is asking here when they ask that kind of question. The psalmist's appeal for God's judgment is also harsh, though less so when the poet adds to his prayer or request that God judge him too. Go to Psalm 7 real quick. Psalm 7. So the first one, the shame and dishonor, we remember there's the four ideas. The first one was shame and dishonor. But in Psalm 7 is the one that references bringing judgment on the enemy. So if you look at verses 6 and 7, arise, O Lord, in your anger. Lift yourself up because of the rage of my enemies. Rise up for me to the judgment you have commanded. So the congregation of the peoples, this is verse 7, shall surround you. For their sakes, therefore, return on high. The Lord shall judge the peoples. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and according to my integrity within me. Oh, let the wickedness of the wicked come to an end, but establish the just. For the righteous God tests the hearts and minds. My defense is of God, who saves the upright in heart. So, to bring shame and dishonor, that first idea there, as we go back to number 4, God, please judge them. And that request of please judge them is, number 1, God, bring shame or dishonor on them. Or number 2, bring about judgment, like he sits on a throne, like a judge would sit on a throne here to cast and bring judgment. But he says there, not just judge them, but judge all of us and judge me. Now, he's pretty confident when he says that. And to ask God to judge you, I would imagine you probably should be pretty confident, because that's a pretty heavy thing to ask. Could you confidently tell God, okay, God, judge me based off how I've lived today? That's or how I've lived this past week, or how I lived in 2024 so far. That's a bold ask. But the psalmist says that. So in this, he's not just asking judgment on the enemy, but he does kind of bring himself into the equation too, even though he's got this confidence that he's living in the right. So he's not worried about that judgment. He does ask God to judge everyone, not just the enemies. Nonetheless, with that, their hope is that God give the enemy what he or she deserves, and that this repayment will cause irreparable damage to the enemy. And the final subcategory, remember that was the third subcategory, the give them what they deserve, repay them what they deserve. The final subcategory, that God would cut off or destroy the enemy, we see these brief wishes clearly convey in words, only a few words, that they convey kind of a violent and deadly wish, that God cut off or destroy or bring death to the enemy. And so that idea of judge them. So remember, silence. How do we respond to God in prayers in these psalms when we have enemies? One is silence. Acknowledge God's goodness and the importance of trusting in God. 2 is when you are looking more at yourself and asking God, please deliver me from my enemies. Knowing that in doing that, you're asking God to act on your enemies, but you're not telling him what to do. You're just saying, please help me. The third is to acknowledge how God deals with wickedness and what God says he will do with the wicked. The fourth is these 4 subcategories we've just said. The fourth is the judge. God judge them. Whether that's judge them by bringing shame and dishonor on them, whether it's judge them by that God would literally be bringing judgment as the true judge, whether it's judge them by repaying them what they deserve after making that judgment, or God judge them by realizing what they deserve is this cruel and awful death for their wickedness. In that fourth idea that God would cut off or destroy the enemy. So number 4 there was to judge them. The 5th one, the final one here, is to slay them. The final and most extreme group of laments on the trajectory of responses here is this fully developed imprecation. When you look, really, there's about 8 psalms that fall into this category. Psalm 35, Psalm 58, Psalm 59, Psalm 69, Psalm 79, and Psalm 83, 109, and 137. Those are the 8. 35, 58, 59, 69, 79, 83, 109, and 137. But when you look at these, there is this extreme example. We're going to look at 2 of these, not all 8. So the first, go with me to Psalm 58. Psalm 58. Went too far. Now, the title above this psalm says, The Just Judgment of the Wicked. All right, and if you drop down to verse 6 of Psalm 58, we're going to read from verse 6 through the end of the chapter, through the end of the psalm in verse 11. Break their teeth in their mouth, O God. Well, that starts off pretty vicious. Break out the fangs of the young lions, O Lord. Let them flow away as waters which run continually. When he bends his bow, let his arrows be as if cut in pieces. Let them be like a snail which melts away as it goes, like a stillborn child of a woman, that they may not see the sun. Before your pots can feel the burning thorns, he shall take them away as with a whirlwind, as in his living and burning wrath. The righteous shall rejoice when he sees the vengeance. He shall wash his feet in the blood of the wicked, so that men will say, surely there is a reward for the righteous. Surely he is God who judges in the earth. Now, how does that sound when you read that psalm? It's pretty intense, vivid. Okay? Should the psalmist not say those things? Is this one of the reasons people have a problem looking into Psalms of Lament, is when you get into these imprecatory psalms and people talking this way to God? Is there anything to learn from that? Is that how a Christian should pray? That's kind of what we're going to talk about at the end of class. But I think as we look at this and another one, it's not about the language used as much as it is about the sincerity and honesty flowing from the heart and the mouth of the psalmist, and finding a way to talk to God in intense and immense pain and suffering and struggle. And we'll kind of see that. But let's go to Psalm 35. Let's look at another one of these. And these are the only 2 we're really going to look at for time's sake this evening that fall in this category. This one says, it's a Psalm of David, says, the Lord, the avenger of his people. Psalm 35. Look at verse 4, and we're going to read through verse 8. Psalm 35, verse 4. Let those be put to shame and brought to dishonor who seek after my life. Let those be turned back and brought to confusion who plot my hurt. Let them be like chaff before the wind, and let the angel of the Lord chase them. Let their way be dark and slippery, and let the angel of the Lord pursue them. For without cause they have hidden their net for me in a pit, which they have dug without cause for my life. Let destruction come upon him unexpectedly, and let his net that he has hidden catch himself. Into that very destruction let him fall. These imprecatory psalms, these imprecations, do not come to us from eras of peace, or even in cases where there is a national leader, for example, like a time when there's a king necessarily, where a national leader, a king, was wicked, I should say, even very wicked. Nor do these imprecations come from or arise from petty personal or individual, vendettas. These thoughts, these psalms, these fully developed imprecations arise from the worst imaginable situations. In Psalm 35, there is one who is unjustly accused and on trial for his or her life. Same is true in Psalm 109, where this legal system and its judge are very corrupt, and so corrupt they're beyond remediation. We see in Psalm 58. In times of national crisis is where you find these kinds of psalms, Psalm 59, 69, and 83, and national devastation in Psalm 79 and 137. Nonetheless, the violence seems over the top, seems rabid, seems ultra-fanatical. It seems crazy. In these psalms, the poets are not content to merely describe the enemy or ask God's help for themselves, but nor really are they satisfied with pronouncing what God will do to the opponents or demand that God judge them. Instead, these writers spell out what they want God to do to the enemy, to their enemy, with these precise and grotesque images, broken teeth, dissolved snails. It's kind of gross, right? Dissolved snails, withered grass, chaff in the wind, and may they come to their fate quickly and unaware until the moment that they fall into that trap net that we just read. Even if we allow for some hyperbole, or even a lot of hyperbole here with this language, we can admit that the writers may have never intended for anyone to take their words literally. Even if we did that, though, their anger and appeals for retribution are really kind of unnerving, even if you acknowledge great hyperbole or that they didn't mean literally here. There's dangers in the extremes. At first sight, these imprecatory psalms look like really a centuries-old mummy that really kind of has been brought out into the clear light of day. They're decayed and still reeking of death. You can't just pick and choose which psalms you'll listen to or accept and which ones you are going to throw out because of what they say. People have tried to do that with the Bible. We don't need some of this Old Testament. We don't, we're under the New, so we don't even need our Old Testament. Some very, very famous speakers, they call themselves pastors, some very famous ministers in different denominations will make claims and statements that we don't need the Old Testament. When you find the writing in the New Testament, what? The things that were written aforetime, written in the Old, were written for what purpose? Our learning that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. If God didn't want us to have the Old Testament or think about it or read it, then we wouldn't have it. And so there are other things where certain verses call out or condemn a certain lifestyle choice, and people will ignore those, but then go to other verses to try to say something or prove something. And we can't pick and choose which pieces of God's Word we're going to obey and which ones we're going to ignore. And I don't mean by that that we treat the old law like it's the new law. There's obviously a difference in the two. But I do mean that in the old and the new laws that we can't go and say, well, this is all part of the new covenant. I don't like what this says, but I do like what this says. So I'll acknowledge this, but God didn't mean that. And that sounds crazy, but that's what people do with the Bible. And the same is true with these Psalms. We can't have a pick and choose approach to the Psalms because it's a dicey option that creates more problems than it solves. When you start to do that, once we begin excising texts, removing them from the Bible as a whole, at what level do we decide a psalm or a prayer is unacceptable or acceptable? What standard do you go by to decide that? When it details what we think God should do to our enemy, when it asks God to judge or repay our enemy without spelling out the details, when it pronounces that what God will do to them, or when it asks God to rescue me, help me, save me, realizing or not the consequences of what my rescue means for my enemy. Where do we draw the line on which one of those are acceptable or not acceptable? If we go this direction, then our refined sensibilities may lead us to a place where we are unable to pray about much of anything because of kind of the inescapable and complex real-world consequences of that. So we can't have a pick and choose, well, I like the way this psalm says it, but that sounds crazy, so I'm just going to ignore this psalm. That doesn't help us. Secondly, Once we begin deleting text of the Bible, another problem that comes with that is, what's to stop us from banishing text from the New Testament, as I was kind of referencing a moment ago? Nothing. We would end up having to do that. If we were going to be theologically consistent, we would have to do that at some point. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, kind of a willy-nilly use of the imprecatory Psalms has the potential to devastate God's way in this world. I'm going to give you this, and this is the way that it's not appropriate, and it was wrong. This is a true thing. You might remember when this happened. I don't remember when it actually happened, but it was in 2009, and it was June 2009. Do you remember the name Wiley Drake? It's something he said about Barack Obama when he was elected president. I want to read this to you because this is taking the imprecatory Psalms and abusing and misusing and misunderstanding them and their purpose. Okay? So in June 2009, Wiley Drake spoke openly about his prayers of imprecation regarding President Barack Obama in an interview on the Alan Colmes show, which is on Fox News Radio. He was asked directly if he was praying for the death of the president. And this is what Wiley Drake said. He said, yes. Now, question, does that go against what Paul says about how we are to view our worldly leaders? Yes. What are we supposed to do? Pray for them, right? Now, he's praying. He answers on this radio station, this news radio, yes, I'm praying for his death. Well, when Colmes asked again, you would like for the President of the United States to die? Drake replied, if he does not turn to God and does not turn his life around, I am asking God to enforce imprecatory prayers that are throughout the Scriptures that would cause him death. That is correct. That's nuts. That's crazy. That's nothing about what we see in the New Testament. Now, we should pray that he does turn to God. Absolutely. But this is a total abuse and misuse of what these Psalms even are. He just didn't like the president. His comments created a small sensation. Not only a Christian, and I use that term very loosely, Drake was a Southern Baptist pastor, and he was a political activist, and one time, second vice president in the Southern Baptist Convention. During the interview, Drake tried to explain his position. He said, I think it is appropriate to pray the Word of God. I agree with that statement. I'm not saying anything. What I am doing is repeating what God is saying. I don't agree with that. I do think it helps to pray the Word of God. You know, you want to find a good prayer? Go and read some of these Psalms and pray the Psalms. There is some power behind that. These are hymns, you know, there's songs as well. Sing these. In fact, we do sing a lot of these Psalms. But this is a guy that has done a lot of damage and has totally misused and abused and misunderstood what these Psalms are, their purpose, and what they mean for us. That's not how we are to pray for our leaders of this country. You might not like who is elected, but as Christians, we should be praying for them, praying they find wisdom, that they do lead in the right ways, even if it's not who we vote for. We should pray for them. We should pray for all people that are in any positions of leadership, country-wise, church-wise. Pray for those people. Leading is hard, no matter which, area you're leading in. But we need to make sure we're praying for our leaders. Even if we don't like them, we should not pray for their death. That's not what these Psalms are. Now, it's very alarming at the potential damage to the reputation of Christ and Christians when people like that do things like that. In fact, you and I are fighting a lot of battles now trying to talk to people about our faith. How many people have shut you down the moment you said the phrase Church of Christ? Part of it might be because they talked to a member of the Church of Christ and it didn't go well, and maybe they were mistreated. Maybe they weren't and they thought they were. Maybe there was harsh language. I don't know, but it was to the point where now they've got a preconceived idea of how this conversation is going to go, and you already are trying to fight your way uphill to try to even have a normal conversation about faith with that person. Let's not do anything to damage the reputation of Jesus or his church. May all that we do let people see who he really is. It's tempting to conclude that our position is God's position with such confidence that we can stand in for God. Consequently, Paul's instruction was to be subject to governing authorities, Romans 13, 1 and 2, or any other biblical admonition. We might think that or any other biblical admonition doesn't apply to us because we're God's spokesman. We're standing in for God here. That's the demeanor and the attitude of Wiley Drake. Well, I'm speaking for God, so I'm going to say this and hang my hat on, I said what the truth is. But he totally didn't say what the truth is, but that's another factor. But sometimes we can judge our actions and lack of tact or love and hide behind, well, I just said the truth. And that's damaging too. There's got to be a combination of truth. You can't sacrifice and compromise one for the other. They've got to flow together and come together. When we identify our cause as God's cause and ourselves as God's representatives, we could feel entitled to pronounce God's curse on others, whether I speak that aloud or not. After all, we are right and everyone else is wrong. And when we have that mentality, we're right, you're wrong, we have become like gods. Or in other words, we have become like God. And we find ourselves struggling with that desire Adam and Eve had to be like God. We are not God. We are not the final judge. We are not the ones to bring about a curse. We are not the ones to condemn. We are the ones to preach truth and show truth and let truth connect with hearts. There are condemning words in the Scriptures. There are life-saving words in the Scriptures. We must show both the condemning words, the life-saving words. But we are not the condemners and the judgers. We are the messengers of God's gospel, of his good news, relaying that there is condemnation coming to those who are disobedient, coming to those that worship in ways unauthorized, that choose to not be baptized for remission. They're coming to these people that are choosing life of disobedience, whether in worship or outside of worship, whether to just straight up live a life full of sin altogether and leave any kind of church or any kind of Christian life at all and just go into the world and live a massive sin. There are so many people choosing that, and we need to make sure that people understand there are consequences when you disobey God, whether it is in your life daily, whether it is in the church, whether it is in the functioning of the church, whether it is, fill in the blank, the worship of the church, there's consequences. But ultimately, we are also then to combine with that the positivity of Jesus. Right? Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. But the best part of that verse is the last part. But the gift of God is eternal life. Here's the reality. Condemnation is real and it happens, but there's also a gift that'll save you from that. And when you have the gift part, then you can have the hard conversations with people because there's always a positive when you come back to Jesus. People need to hear that hell is just as real as heaven. They're both real. And people are going to go to both places. So we need to do everything we can to teach people how to be with God for eternity. And we do that through his inspired word. So it's not up to us to go into these and see how Israel, or how the poets, the psalmists are praying for God to judge the enemies and say, well, I'm going to use that and I'm going to come out and I'm going to pray harsh things towards people that have treated me wrong. That's not what we're thinking about here. We got to be very careful. We got to think about some principles from these Psalms. I know we're out of time, but I do want to mention these principles. If nothing else, these imprecatory Psalms teach us how to pray the ethic that Paul taught the church at Rome. In his letter to the Romans, Paul cites Proverbs 25 when he says this. He says, "If your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads." We already talked about the burning coals falling, but he says, feed them and take care of them. The meaning of the second half is debated, this burning coals thing. Are the coals helpful or are they harmful? That's not what we're thinking about right now. The ethic is clear, help your enemies. And it's emphasized in Romans 12, 17 through 21, all through there. Help your enemies. Jesus, love your enemies. Pray for those. Help those. Jesus helped his enemies. So Paul's concern on the one hand is that the Christians in Rome not take matters into their own hands and repay or avenge a wrong. Paul urges them to leave the righting of wrongs to God, because he's the one that will right the wrongs. Now, if nothing else, also the imprecations, imprecatory psalms imprecations, they also teach us the level of honesty that God seeks in our prayers. Prayer is not a matter of agreeing with God. Prayer is a conversation and is confessing the truth about ourselves and our desires and letting God sort out what is appropriate, inappropriate, right, wrong, best, or not good. Letting God act, not me. Give you an example. Think of those that prayed in the Bible and what God said in their prayer. Moses prayed that God would change his mind and let him enter the promised land. God said no, Deuteronomy 3, 23 through 26. Paul prayed that God would remove this thorn in the flesh. God said no, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, 7 through 10. Jesus, the Son of God, prayed that God would remove this cup from him, from me. And God said no, Matthew 26, 39. God says no. It's not about trying to make God say yes to what we want. It's about trusting that God will answer in relation to what he desires and what is best. And what is best might not be what we want or what we think is best. And God said no to Moses, to Paul, to his own son, Jesus, as he prayed in the garden. So there's going to be times where we might hear no. And that has to be okay. We have to accept that. The third thing, I know we're out of time, the imprecatory psalms prompt us to take our eyes off of ourselves and to see the world, to pray for others. It's okay, you're going to pray a lot for me, right? We do that. But we need to make sure that in our prayers we're praying also for others. For the church, for leadership, for family members, for friends and loved ones, for enemies, for random people, praying for others. Our prayers don't need to be just about us, but they need to be focused on others as well. Here's the truth. I'll leave you with this. When we are disturbed about what disturbs God, our prayers will change, as will what we do outside the safe confines of our church building or our homes. When what upsets God upsets me, then the way that I pray and the way that I live will change. Thank y'all for being here tonight. I know we're out of time. I appreciate you. And I guess enjoy some fellowship here, and we'll see you again in just a few minutes.